Welcome to Italics, television for the Italian-American experience. I'm your host, Anthony Tamburri. This past March 25th marked the 108th anniversary of the tragedy of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. On March 25, 1911, the building in which the factory was housed took fire. The doors to many of the exits were chained shut, and 146 people died. Until the events of September 11, 2001, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was the deadliest workplace disaster in New York City. The fire eventually helped redefine the U.S. industrial workers and their rights in the workplace. In the studio today, we have with us Dr. Anne Trasciatti, professor of Writing Studies and Rhetoric at Hofstra University. She is with us today in her role as president of the Remember the Triangle Fire Coalition, whose general mission is to educate the public about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire through its ongoing projects, its educational outreach, and social media sites. Of particular interest for us today is the project Reframing the Sky, the Triangle Fire Memorial. Welcome to Italics, Marianne.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you for having me.
Before we get to the Reframing the Sky, why don't you give our viewers just a little bit of a history on the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory? Because it seems that it's sort of, at least within this Italian-American collective, it seems that it's fallen a little bit out of memory.
It really is an important moment in the history of Italian Americans and in the history of the U.S. So, as you mentioned, there was a fire in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, which occupied the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of what was then called the Ash Building. It's now called the Brown Building, and it's an NYU building just 1 block east of Washington Square Park at the intersection of Washington Place and Green Streets. It was about 4:45 on an early spring morning, March 25th. And what we think happened is that a cutter who was working on the 8th floor was smoking a cigarette, and the ash from that cigarette fell into a bin of scraps of fabric. And the scraps of fabric burst into flames, and the air was so thick with threads and fabric that the air itself went on fire. And the workers on the 8th floor and the 10th floor were able to escape. So there was a call from the telephone on the 8th floor up to the switchboard on the 10th floor. Workers on the 10th floor went out up onto the roof, and they were ferried across to safety by NYU law students to the building next door, which was an NYU law building. Workers on the 8th floor were able to go down the elevator. There was an elevator operator at the time. His name was Joseph Zito, a young man, and he took workers down in the elevator, and he could have just taken a load down and said, that was it, I've done my duty, but he didn't. He really, truly was a hero. He kept going up and down, ferrying workers to safety for as long as he could. So workers on the 8th floor, for the most part, got out down the elevator. They went through the doors. There was a problem because the doors opened inward. So you can imagine the panic of a fire, and you rush to the doors, and you have to have the wherewithal to step back and let them open inward. But some of the workers did get out that way. 10th floor workers went across. 9th floor workers were not so fortunate. The switchboard operator on the 10th floor who got the call from the 8th floor never notified them that there was a fire, so they didn't know until it was too late. When they did find out, as you might imagine, panic ensued. They rushed to the elevator. They rushed to the door. One of the doors had a barrel of oil in front of it that exploded from the flames and the heat, and so that was unusable, and the other door was locked. Probably to keep out union organizers and to keep theft from happening. We know that theft was minimal. We do know they were worried about union organizing. And so they pushed into the elevator as many as could, but 146 of them could not get out. They either burned to death inside the building, or at least 60 of them actually jumped out the 9th floor window and hit the pavement below. And the reason they had to jump was because although the fire department came right away, their ladders only reached up to the 6th floor. And so they held out nets, but the girls who jumped actually crashed through the nets. So in the end, 146, primarily Italian and Jewish immigrant workers, a third of them Italian, some of them in the US for less than a year, and some of them only 14 years old, died that day. Hundreds of New Yorkers and visitors who were in and around Washington Square Park watched horrified. You know, they looked up at the girls standing on the ledges of the building, holding hands, clutching onto their wages, and then looked down as they hit the pavement. And everyone was horrified. It was really an awful, awful day.
And of course, there is the second tragedy of it, and that is nobody was really held accountable.
No. So the building was fireproof. It was really a state-of-the-art building. But of course, the contents were not, and the people were not. And there were minimal safety precautions because they really weren't required at the time. So they had buckets of water in the event of a fire. They had locked doors. They had doors that opened inward. They did not have mandatory fire drills. So they really weren't prepared for handling the chaos of an emergency, and they just didn't have the fire safety mechanisms. They also didn't have enough exits. Because of the size of the building, they should have had 3 exits, but they petitioned and got an exemption from that code, and they were allowed to claim that the fire escape was a 3rd exit. And that was a tragic exception because workers who tried to escape down the fire escape were killed when it collapsed, and at least one of them was impaled on the fire escape. So the deck was stacked against them safety-wise from the very beginning.
What were some of the good results from it?
Yeah, the thing about most episodes in labor history in the U.S. and around the world is they don't end well, right? And this one certainly didn't start well, but it did have a positive twist. After the fire, and New Yorkers were just in shock, and really, I mean, there was guilt, there was sadness, there was anger, there was indignation. So you had workers in the needle trades who really stepped up their organizing. They declared a general strike in 1913, and you had the state of New York, Governor Al Smith, really, I think, stepped forward and said, all right, we need to do something about the conditions of work in our factories. And so Robert Wagner, the Assembly, and the governor of New York got together and created what was called the Factory Investigating Commission. And they traveled around the state of New York, visiting factories and getting a sense for safety issues, child labor issues, sanitation issues. It started with a substantial agenda that just continued to grow. One of the chief inspectors for that commission was a woman named Frances Perkins.
I happened to have been visiting a friend in the park, on the other side of the park, and we heard the engines and we heard the screams and rushed out and rushed over where we could see where the trouble was. We could see this building from Washington Square, and the people had just begun to jump. It was a horrifying spectacle.
From that moment forward, became a dedicated advocate for working people in New York, and ultimately as the first female cabinet member, Secretary of Labor under FDR, in the nation. And so Perkins and the other investigators on the committee, they put their report forward, and upon the recommendations of this commission and the testimony of Edward Croker, who was the fire chief at the time, New York became a leader in workplace safety legislation and in child labor legislation. So things like limiting the age at which children could work, mandating fire drills, maximum occupancy limits, fire extinguishers, safety exits, all of those things are a legacy of the Triangle Fire.
At the Triangle, there were workers as young as 14, right?
Yeah, and in fact, that happens all the time. That was not an unusual thing. And some of the workers who claim to be 14 may in fact have been younger, because we know that families lied about the age of their children because they were desperate for the income and they needed them to work.
Out of this comes, and this is sort of part of my history growing up, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, because in my family, there was a dress factory, and so as a little kid, I remember the big rolls of little stickers that that the women used to sew onto the garments.
Yeah. So you have garment workers in your family?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, a lot. And so a couple of important names come out of this, right? Angela Bambace, for example, who was one of the founders of the union, and I think became like vice president or something.
Yeah, so she was one of the organizers of the Italian language local that was eventually founded, and was, she was one of the first women, if not the first woman, on the executive board of the ILGWU. And my mom, in fact, was a member of the ILGWU. There are lots of New Yorkers, lots of Italian Americans with roots in this industry. And my mom taught me about the Triangle Fire. She worked in a dress factory and told me that she knew that she was safe because of what had happened to the girls at Triangle. So there's a lot of resonance here, I think, for Italian Americans. because of our history in this industry.
So your mother was a seamstress here in
PA. She was a seamstress in northeastern Pennsylvania.
All right.
And this was, of course, in the 40s and 50s,
Yeah.
so long after the fire,
right.
but it was still a real thing.
Right,
her.
exactly.
And then I have a cousin who also worked later on in the garment industry in New York with the next wave of immigrants. So she was an Italian who came over basically because of her skills as a seamstress. It's part of the family unification program.
Right.
And by the time she entered the industry, she was working with a lot of Latinas. So it is an industry that employs, or used to at least in New York, a lot of immigrants, Jews, Italians, Latinas, Asians, not so much anymore, but certainly then.
Let's move on to Reframing the Sky. You mentioned it's the building is now called, it was the Ash Building, now it's called the Brown Building?
It's now called the Brown Building, and it was donated to NYU by Mr. Brown after the fire. So the story of NYU and the Triangle Fire is really implicated, right? But the institution and this history. So NYU owns the building. On the floors that once housed long tables with sewing machines, there are now long laboratory science tables. So in some ways it still resembles the factory, although the work that happens there is much different. So so remember the Triangle Fire Coalition held an international design competition. We signed an historic agreement with NYU that allows us to install a design on their building. So it's a really interesting collaboration here between the coalition and NYU. They signed off on this agreement, and we then held an international design competition. We received entries from over 30 countries, 170 entries. And when we launched the competition, actually before we launched the competition, we had an extensive conversation with the director of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Competition. And he advised us about the complexities of running such a competition. Everybody has an opinion, everybody has a politics, everybody has an idea of what a memorial should look like. And you just can't please everyone. And so on his recommendation, we assembled a stellar jury. It was chaired by Deborah Burke, who is now the Dean of the School of Architecture at Yale. It also had another faculty member in design from Yale University, as well as someone from the New York City Department of Transportation, the Public Art Commission, labor historian, other architects. And they reviewed the entries. It was a blind juried, refereed competition, and came up with a short list. And the #1 ranked design was Reframing the Sky by Richard Janu and Uri Wegman, a team. Interestingly, over 30 countries submitted, and our design team is from Queens. Great. So go figure, right? And it's called Reframing the Sky, and essentially what it is a ribbon made out of steel. So it's a ribbon that drops down from the 9th floor where most of the workers died, and then at about 12 feet above the ground it splits. And then it wraps around. And so the part of the ribbon that drops down actually looks like cloth, right? It's got a sort of winding look to it. And then where it splits, we will stencil into that 12-foot high split the names of everyone who died. And then at about waist level, there's a material called stone glass. It's a black glass that has metal worked into it. And it actually comes from Italy. It's only made in Italy. It's an Italian product, and it's extraordinarily beautiful. And what it does is it reflects the names that have been stenciled. As the light passes through those names at 12 feet, they're reflected in this stone glass.
Oh, wonderful.
And originally that panel was going to be also a reflective metal, like the rest of the memorial. But input from the community convinced us that probably wasn't a good idea, too much reflectivity. And what the stone glass does is it actually polarizes the light. So you can look into it in bright daylight, see the names reflected. And what you also see as you're walking by is you see text that we have composed that narrates the story of the fire. So here's what happens. You're far away and you see this thing coming down the building, right? So it's got scale and you think, what's that? And you walk up and you see that people are looking at this black panel, right? And so you walk up and you notice these names reflected, and then you realize there's a story here. So you walk to the beginning and you follow the story. So you're walking, your whole body is involved in this memorial. And as you look closer to read and to see the names reflected, and you look up and you look down, a few things are happening. One is you are mimicking the behavior of the spectators who were there in 1911. You're looking up and you're looking down.
Yeah.
So it really positions contemporary visitors in the same place as historic spectators. Yeah. And the other thing is that you are walking, you are moving, you are involving your whole self in this. So you're getting a narrative and you're getting the names. And then finally, as you look in close, you see yourself. So you are drawn into this, hence reflecting the sky, reframing the sky, because the whole experience of looking up and looking down is reframed by the entry of yourself into the narrative. So we think it's a very understated but very powerful design that gets your mind and your body, and we hope your heart, involved in this. And one of the things we hope, or we intend, is that people who come to the village, who are just walking around, some of them actually looking for the building and not able to find it, will no longer be able to walk past it without knowing that it's there.
And the history of it. And so this is a partnership between NYU, the state of New York, right, the governor's office, because I'll ask you to get into that, and potential new partners.
Yes.
So explain.
It's a really interesting public-private partnership. That's one of the things that makes this a fascinating project. So the Brown Building was landmarked. And so in order to get approval to put the design on the building, we had to take it to the Landmarks Preservation Commission.
But the important thing is that the building was landmarked, so it'll never disappear.
Never disappear.
So that's the first, right?
Right. Yeah. So we had, so we had to go to the community board, we had to go to Landmarks, so we had to have a lot of public engagement. Yeah. And in the process of doing this, the project came to the attention of Governor Andrew Cuomo. And he was very moved by the project and also very moved by our struggle to raise money for the project. And so he stepped in and said, I mean, I'm not exaggerating. I got a phone call from someone in the Labor Commissioner's office saying, can you get us a budget ASAP? And I said, yeah, well, give me a week or so. And they said, no, like today. And we got the budget together, and the governor looked at it and said, this is a worthwhile project. I'm going to fund the capital budget. So we've got this really terrific partnership between the coalition, the state of New York, the city of New York, and this private university,
so,
NYU.
Excuse me, explain the capital budget.
Okay, the capital budget is essentially the budget, the funds that are needed to fabricate, what they call in architectural language,
speak,
to fabricate and then install the memorial. So everything that it takes to go from where we are now to the dedication, permits, fees for engineers, the actual getting the stone glass here from Italy, and making the memorial. So that part is completely funded by the state of New York. So now what we're looking to do is to kind of increase the private elements of this partnership and raise the money that we will need for the endowment, which is essentially the fund that we will maintain in perpetuity to repair the memorial should it be damaged, to clean it periodically, to take it down should the building for any reason need repairs. New York's very strict, in part thanks to the Triangle Fire, about the safety of people walking on the streets. And so periodically, it's called Local Law 11, buildings have to be reviewed by the city to make sure that there's nothing structurally wrong that could fall off or damage. So we have to supply the funds in the case that something happens on the building, that the memorial can be taken off and put back on. And all that money has to be raised from private funds. We're hoping that people will step up, the stakeholders, people whose history this is, right? Whose story this is, and help us to tell it with this memorial.
The governor gave 7 figures, right? The state is giving 7 figures. And and that'll cover everything, as you just said. And so you need almost as many figures.
I can give you a ballpark range. So the capital budget is $1.5 million, which sounds like a lot of money, and it is, except in the context of significant memorials to really essential events, right? And you can't tell the history of New York or of the U.S., of labor and women, without talking about the Triangle Fire. So for a memorial for something so significant, that isn't an extensive amount of money. The fund that we need for the endowment, because this is something that has to be there for as long as the memorial is there, which we hope will be forever, is anywhere from $850,000 to over $1 million, $1.25 million. So that's what we're looking to raise right now. And we're hoping that the story speaks as movingly to contemporary New Yorkers as it did, and residents really all over the U.S. and the world, as it did back in 1911.
So there's a committee for Reframing the Sky. You're the president, and you have just launched your campaign, 108th anniversary. Why has it taken this long?
You know, that's a question that's arguable,
Yeah.
right? The answer to that is arguable. I can tell you I have a few theories. Yeah. The first is because this was an industrial disaster that directly affected primarily women. Of the 146, most were women. Right. And it affected not just women, but immigrant women, working class immigrant women. And there just isn't a lot of wherewithal behind movements to build memorials that honor the sacrifices, in this case, the unwilling. So, I mean, these were not people who said, yes, I'm willing to die at work today for exit signs on the doors, right? Yeah. There just isn't a lot of wherewithal behind that. I mean, most memorials are not built to honor working class immigrant women. And so I think that's a large part of why we've waited so long. We also don't do very well in the US remembering labor history. Yeah. There aren't a lot of labor monuments in the US. And US labor history is extraordinarily important. It was extraordinarily bloody. The battles were monumental, and we want to forget those. Mm-hmm. We perpetuate this myth of the classless society, and this is an episode that says, no, this was not and is not a classless society, right. And immigrant women matter. Our world, our city, our state, our world is built on the backs of women like the women who toiled at the Triangle Fire, mm-hmm. and we just don't do enough to recognize that. Mm-hmm.
I think the one thing we always ignore in a lot of the conversations that we have about these social issues is class. And then, of course, also gender, and then immigration. And unfortunately, current immigration is being also devalued and denigrated to a point, dehumanized to a point. So you guys are doing this, and I just want to say, as we say in Italian, tanto di cappello, hats off to you, because it's not easy. It's not easy at all.
It is not easy, but we are a stalwart bunch.
But you got this far, which is really important. Yeah. 3, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, this was just a pipe dream. Am I correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, right. Yeah. But it's an amazing group of people. Yeah. We have a couple of people who we hire, as consultants to do this or that, but it's almost all volunteers. Mm-hmm. And I got to tell you, we pull rabbits out of our hat just about every day to make this happen. It is the sheer determination of the Remember the Triangle Fire Coalition, and we hope the generosity of our supporters who will make this happen, and of course the generosity of the state of New York and of NYU.
The example of Governor Cuomo is so important with regard to information. People need to get that information, and I think that's what you guys represent.
What really makes America great are ordinary, working class people like you, and like the ones who worked at Triangle 108 years ago. And now, as I stand in solidarity with the family members of Triangle workers, I'd like to remember Jenny Levin, 19 years old, Pauline Levine, 19 years old, Rose Larmark, 19 years old, Bettina Mayale, 19 years old, and as I said to my dear friend Kevin Baker, that's 4 too many teenagers, Frances Mayale, 21, Rose Mankowski, 22, and Jenny Stellino, 16.
Everyone goes down every year, and it's wonderful that people go down, and there's the ceremony that takes place, and people chalk the names, but there has never been anything permanent. Right. And this is what's good about this, is that it's a permanence of remembering.
Absolutely. And for me, it gets personal sometimes. I'm the daughter of garment workers. Yeah. And I get very emotional when I think about this. I'm the granddaughter of an illiterate Italian immigrant woman.
Well, a lot of us are.
Right?
Yeah.
And it hurts me when I hear contemporaries, my contemporaries who disparage contemporary immigrants. Right. And I think, except that, it was my grandmother and your grandmother and, everybody else's grandmother who was feeling the hate, 50, 100, 150 years ago, right? And every time we are insensitive to the issues, to the debate, and we respond in a kind of knee-jerk way. I think we do our ancestors a disservice because they struggled and they died, right? And nobody cared, and to not care about contemporary struggles, I think, is really to dishonor their memory. And so part of what we do in the coalition is we don't just, on March 25th every year, we don't just remember the 146, we remember everyone who died in an industrial accident. We say names, the workers in Bangladesh, anyone in the US who died, and we speak on behalf of all immigrants who come here looking for a better life, who work hard, and who often don't get treated with the respect that they deserve.
And you mentioned the workers in Bangladesh and other places like that who today are still working in sweat factories and are making the clothes, the shirts, the suits, the dresses, etc., for all the great designers. I mean, a lot of those things are being made in, for lack of a better term, those places in the world that are not quote-unquote first world, as some people might say.
Vijay Junta at Jersey City University and I are collaborating on a book, an anthology of intimate and political essays on the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. It's called Talking to the Girls. And as part of that project 2 weeks ago, we interviewed Kalpona Akhtar, who is an organizer of garment workers in Bangladesh, and she is an extraordinarily brave woman. She's traveled around the world. She has been beaten. She has been verbally abused. She started working in the garment factory when she was 16, and she is extraordinarily moved by the story of the Triangle Fire and by the struggles of the women there and by the response of the union and the government after the fire to improve working conditions in the US. And when we spoke to her and asked her thoughts about the legacy of the Triangle, she said, well, the only thing that's changed is the place. The Triangle Fire is, we don't have Triangle Fires here in the US anymore, but we do have deadly industrial accidents in places like Bangladesh, in Italy, in other countries around the world. So, and she's right, the only thing that has changed is the place. That needs to not be true. There are monuments and plaques for every Italian who died in the fire. There is a monument or a plaque, a piazza or a street named after them. So on any given day, if you are, for example, in Sicily, or if you are in the hometown even of Joe Zito in Serra, you will see a plaque that has the name of someone who died in the fire. If they can do it, we can do it. But we need the help of people here. I mean, this is our story. It's a story we can be proud of. It's a moving story. And it's only going to be told if we stand up and do the right thing and make this memorial happen.
Hopefully, this little conversation will help.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thanks for watching this episode of Italics. I'm Anthony Tamburri. Arrivederci alla prossima puntata.